I mean, Michael, honestly, the United States has a serious problem. It has a kind of rot in its soul. This is a country that, from its inception, was not able to handle the crime of having human beings as property. I mean, there's not many countries in the world that from their inception were given the opportunity to walk away from having human beings as property. None of the founding fathers stood up and said that we think that human beings should not be property. I mean, there's a rot in the soul of the American original story. And then right through, there's never really been an accounting of this. And therefore, punctually, every time there's a particularly grotesque incident of violence by the police, there is a cycle of uprisings. This is a punctual thing. It's not between the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson and George Floyd. I'm told that there have been thousands of people killed by the police department. Not all African American, not all Latinos, but thousands of people killed by the police department. That hurts me as a human being. That's something that should actually hurt people, that a police department would kill so many people. You have a civilization, and I'm sorry I'm using the word civilization a lot, but you have a civilization that believes that it's better to use social resources to put a police officer between food and a hungry person than to just use those resources to feed the hungry person. I mean, Eric Garner was killed because he was allegedly selling loose cigarettes. George Floyd was killed because he was allegedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill. These are two people hungry, wanting to feed their family. Why not, as a civilization, find a way to feed the family rather than hire people to stand between food and the hungry? This is a choice that a civilization has made. And the United States needs to look this choice in the eye and say that either we accept this choice or we reject this choice. And it seems to me that when young people, when sensitive people say defund the police, what they're actually saying, Michael, is they're saying, I would prefer to get George Floyd food than hire a police officer to prevent him from eating. I'd prefer for Eric Garner and his children, Erica and others, I'd prefer them to get resources to have a dignified life than to hire police officers to suffocate him on the street. That's what they're saying. They're not saying, let's get rid of the police. They're not naive. But they're making an argument that the civilizational choice made by the United States is unacceptable. And I tend to agree with them. It's an unacceptable thing. Hungry people should never be prevented from food by a police officer. I think that is a vulgarity. And a vulgarity, particularly when it's so much on racial grounds. So in that sense, the United States is a decaying civilization. And the young, sensitive people on the streets, they recognize that. And I applaud them for that. I understand that there was frustration over the deep violence. And, by the way, rioting does happen. Rioting is not something that happens because it's, driven by somebody. No, it's a direct reaction to a decayed system. Right. People are frustrated, they're angry, they just come out. That happens. But then there were these protests organized by often young Black women in many cities. They were the principal organizers, not from any political organization, but they were helped by other organizations and so on. And those took place. That moved into, I think, a very correct questioning of the things that are celebrated in society. Statues, for instance, Confederate statues, throw them away, Columbus and so on. You see, my issue is not that then it goes into the culture war. I would like a conversation to happen, which is not disappointment with the nature of the movement, but to try to deepen and further and advance the movement. So where the movement needs to go now is it needs to come back to the old question. And I understand that this old question, eyeballs will roll, people will sigh, but it's the old question of reparations. I mean, look, reparations it's a very maybe antagonistic word. It's a fighting kind of word, but this is what it means. It means 40 acres and a mule. You promised after the abolition of enslavement, you promised reconstruction. You gave a slogan, 40 acres and a mule. If I calculate the price of 40 acres and a mule from 1865 to 2020, it amounts to reparations. What do you need? You need to have a serious discussion about the fact that there is enormous amount of wealth in the United States and in tax havens that should be brought into productive use inside the United States. You cannot have a country, the United States, such a rich country, where somebody is not able to feed themselves and their family. In fact, I believe that nobody on the planet Earth should be hungry. I think hunger is the great abomination of 2020. But if we're talking specifically about the United States, Michael, it is an abomination. People should be able to go and eat food somewhere. That should just be a fact. There should be no need to commodify food. Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's advance the conversation. I'm more interested in that than in saying, oh, the whole debate, the whole struggle has been diverted by the elites and so on. I don't care about the elites. I don't care about Joe Biden. I don't care about the Democratic Party. They interest me nothing, because they are going to be disappointing always. That's not the way to think. I don't care about their blackwashing. I'm more interested in, how do we advance the movement? How do young people who have entered into a movement, often for the first time in their lives, have been politicized? How do we show them? How do we, give them our sense of history and say, what's important? Get the statue down. I agree with you. I don't have any problem. Get Columbus down. I have no problem with that. But now let's demand that everybody get fed.
Are you actually surprised that you don't see more things like rioting in the United States?
Yes, I am surprised. I mean, look, so. The fact is that, you were going to ask me about Kerala or Vietnam or things, and I would like to actually bring that into how I would answer you. When you create a society where public action is delegitimized, in the United States, there's been almost 100-year attack on trade unions, on people's organizations. I mean, you go back to the raids in 1919, the Palmer raids, then McCarthyism. There's been a long history of attacking trade unions, tethering unions, breaking up people's organizations, independent organizations of people. You atomize people, you let them be on their own, then they join relatively illegal and very disturbing type of organizations. That's what happens in places like the United States, where you fragment society. In a place like Kerala, almost everybody is a member of either a trade union, a women's organization, youth organization, student organization, cooperatives, and so on. It's a highly organized society. People don't see themselves as individuals. And by the way, some of the organizations are ascriptive. In other words, they are church groups or they are religious groups or whatever. But people are organized so that when a crisis hits a place like Kerala, public action kicks in immediately. The trade unions come out there, they start feeding people, they build sinks in public, they do all kinds of things. In the United States, when you have a crisis, the magnitude of this pandemic, you don't see the trade unions doing anything. I mean, trade unions have sort of taught themselves to be bargaining units. Where have the trade unions been to bring medicines to the elderly? Where have the trade unions been to feed the homeless, feed the poor? You just don't see them anywhere, Michael. In Cuba, 28,000 medical students walked out of their dormitories and tested 11 million Cuban citizens. That's the totality of the population of Cuba. 28,000 medical students. I haven't seen a medical student from any American university, public or private, go out and test the public. In fact, you're in New York. I doubt that any state official or quasi-state official has rung your doorbell and said, can I stick this thing up your nose to test you? Nobody, because the state has collapsed in the United States and society is not available. And this is the reason why I believe that in a country like the United States, when anything happens, the tendency to mass rioting is much greater because there's no mediation between the people and their frustrations and the elites. There's no organizations, unions, and so on. People just go out there and they're angry. In other societies, there are mediations. That's the price you pay if you destroy society.
How did Kerala create that trajectory for itself?
I mean, look, it took 100 years for Kerala to build this. It's not just that there's a communist government in power there. This is part of the history of the state, building public action into the culture of Kerala, into the society of Kerala, the importance of public action and so on. I mean, look, the United States had the importance of public action. It was such an important part of US history until the early 20th century. In a sense, until the Bolshevik Revolution in the USSR, there were very important public institutions of people in the United States, including trade unions, whether it's the old AFL or it's the IWW, the International Workers of the World. And let's not just stay with unions. Let's talk about neighborhood organizations, and then let's talk about church groups and so on. About 20 years ago, an American political scientist by the name of Robert Putnam wrote a book which had a rather silly title, and it seemed anachronistic. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And the point of the book was that Americans don't belong to things like bowling leagues and various things where they are organized into groups. Now, Robert, the example of bowling in the 21st century is anachronistic. I mean, there's so
bowling,
many.
Vijay?
Look, I don't mind bowling, but to pick bowling leagues and the decline of bowling leagues somehow seemed a little silly. There are other ways of gauging the lack of organized activity. No, look, let's not exaggerate this, because of course people are organized. Friends have groups. They meet, they party together, they have a good time. There are lots of ways in which people continue to reproduce society. It's not like you're sitting by yourself alone, untethered from other people. No, there are friendship groups. They go play sports together. They play pickup games. There are knitting circles. There are lots of ways in which people are organized. But the issue is, does this social organization translate into public action? And I think that's the real gap. And that gap has come because of the actual quite deliberate attack during the McCarthy period to prevent social groups from public action. So, you have now very sensitive and decent people doing mutual aid in this time of COVID, going out, trying to help their neighbors and so on. But it's not at a big scale. It's small groups. The big organizations, the trade unions and so on, they have had their feet cut from under them. They have been reduced to bargaining units. And one of the things that I think one needs to teach them is what unions used to do in the United States. They used to be a site of working class culture. In a community, the union hall was the place where you rented and you had your marriage there. It was the place where you went on the weekend and heard music. It was the place you played bingo and whatever. Those are anachronistic things. I get it. There are modern ways to use.
You're going to go after bowling and then do that list?
I know, but that was in the past. The issue is where is the union hall today? Right. Where is it? I mean, it doesn't exist. The working class culture is not being held together by these organizations. In other countries, they are. And so that's what we need to actually think about, is the translation of our social networks into public action. And you have to have the experience of public action. You can't wait for an emergency. When an emergency happens, we're paralyzed. We don't know what to do. And I think that's what's happened in many of the advanced industrial countries, where there is a kind of paralysis and the state is also useless, so nothing's happening. I just published a book this week called Washington Bullets, which is about the CIA and assassinations and so on. And to write this book, I interviewed tons of ex-CIA people. And I would also like to add that, not because I'm a fan of the CIA, but I know that they actually do function and they work. And it's all terrible stuff that they do. Nothing that the CIA does is good, but they actually are very functional and so is the NSA. Very functional. In fact, they're taping this conversation we're having. Sure. They'll analyze it later. They'll decide, since you're talking to me, whether they should downgrade your status as a human being and so on. But, these are functional institutions. But what's not functional in the state, and I mean, I'm saying this not with any pleasure, are the good side of history. Where is the state when it comes to people, suffering from mental illness? So many stories come, Michael, of somebody with schizophrenia in a public place, having an episode and the cop comes and shoots them to death.
Yes.
So, I mean, I can list one after the other, these stories. What kind of civilization is that where you tolerate the execution of a person with mental illness because the police officer is not trained to deal with them? I'm not even blaming the cop there. I think they just don't have any training. They shouldn't be dealing with that. You need more social workers. You need more public health people. Every street in the United States needs a public health clinic. Why should a person wait to see their primary care doctor, or if they have insurance? If they don't have insurance, go to an emergency room. Why can't they go to a clinic, public health clinic funded by our taxes, where you go in and say, I have a boil. Can you just have a look at it? Oh, the person looks at it and says, that might be skin cancer. We need to, instead of waiting for me to develop advanced skin cancer and then, the costs of that, here they look at it and say, we can launch that and the cancer is gone. Wow, let's do that. Let's have a public health clinic. You don't have those things. So the state has become, in a sense, money, as you said, the state has become money and violence. It's become money in the sense of the Fed and taxation, actually, and violence, the police and the military. You don't see the state as compassionate. And that's another reason why this anti-state attitude develops. I don't think the state is inherently discompassionate. State can be a compassionate state. I would like that. Nothing wrong with a nanny state. They used to make a joke, nanny state. Well, Americans don't get nanny because that's an elite British thing. Elite British people like Boris Johnson had nannies. But nothing wrong with a nanny. This Mary Poppins, you take the medicine with a spoonful of sugar. I'd do that. I'd wear a mask, nanny, if it came with sugar, which means I can live longer. The first thing I would say is I'm very glad you brought up Lula because, in the past 20 years, there haven't been many heads of government that have put hunger front and center in their policy. There haven't been many. I mean, it costs a lot politically to say that the hungry person is the primary focus of my government. It costs a lot politically. The rich are not interested in the hungry. Let's be frank, okay? So Lula is an extraordinary person. Whatever limitations and, you hear a lot of criticism on the left of Lula, which I think is really uncharitable and bogus, and I don't pay attention to it. He's a terrific person. Yeah. And then there are people on the right who say Lula this, Lula that. In fact, what they're afraid of is this is a human being, a genuine human being who ran a government in a sensitive way, putting the hungry people at the forefront. And I really think it's not only admirable, it's very unusual in this period. Let's compare them to Donald Trump, compare Lula to Donald Trump and to Joe Biden. It's no comparison. Here's a human being, and these people are basically not human beings, in my opinion. I don't mean not human beings in an unsympathetic. I mean, their humanity to me is in question. Donald Trump, it's striking how much disregard he seems to have for the basic problems of human beings, and I haven't seen Mr. Biden demonstrate a great compassion, apart from some rhetorical flourishes to win over the left. So the United States is in a particular kind of crisis, long-term political crisis. One of the things that I've really enjoyed in this pandemic is I've enjoyed interacting because of these Zoom meetings and so on with the Democratic Socialists of America, with the the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, with the old left groups and so on. I've really enjoyed interacting with the young people in these movements. Why is that? Because I think they come to politics, Michael, out of a great sense of compassion. They don't come to politics because they think, they're ideological or this or that or whatever. They're not angry. They are compassionate people. I mean, there's a whole generation now that are on the streets saying defund the police from an extraordinarily compassionate place. Now, I'm a Marxist and I'm using the word compassion over and over again, and that might sound odd. But I don't believe that you can have a politics, a genuinely liberatory politics, unless you feel for other people. If you don't feel for people, you can't enter left politics out of a theory. Theories are not enough. You have to actually feel for people suffering, for their struggles, and you have to enter their struggles in order to change the world. And I genuinely feel, and I genuinely believe that this generation that's coming up, not only in the United States, but around the world, they are struck by the immensity of the contradictions, the climate contradictions, the pandemic, the disaster of neoliberalism, the impossibility of capitalism, the very fact that you have a system now that says we prefer to burn food than feed the hungry. All this stuff, it distresses an entire generation. Now, others will say it's traumatizing them. I don't think so. I think it's clarifying for them that the path is either, barbarism entirely or something utterly different. And I think they are choosing utterly different. And I'm very proud of these people. I think that they will essentially walk the road to save the world from barbarism. People like Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro, Trump, even Biden, all these people, they just want to take us, some of them want to accelerate the car to barbarism. Others want to ride the brake to barbarism. They don't have a clue that there's a way to move to a compassionate society. I don't think they have a clue. I just don't think they understand that that's possible. But I think these young people, they have seen, look, the world is going to be destroyed by climate change. The world is destroyed by hunger. The world is destroyed by this system that eats people alive. We don't want this shit. We want something better. And I feel that emotional, that coming from the soul politics is much more hopeful for me than any theory that you'd read in a book. Now, I am a person who reads a lot, who writes a lot, who believes in theory. But I want to say that if you don't feel for humanity, it's not worth it.
Right.
It's not worth it. You have to feel. And the example you gave of Lula, here is a person, Lula, who feels that the pain of a person is just not tolerable. And I think that's the lesson for today. You got to just say it's just intolerable that people are suffering. War escalates technologically. There was a time when cavalries met or people met with pikes and so on. And the moment you could fly a plane above the front line, that changed the terms of war, because you could bomb industrial bases, you could bomb civilians and so on. And you change the character of war. There's always been a part of war which has been information warfare. You'd fly above the front line and you drop leaflets saying, you're going to lose because we're sending. There's always been information war. There's always been economic war. There's always been a multifaceted way in which people have fought. It's never just the pikes. We have God on our side. You are an infidel. That's an information war. But as technology increases and you enter, let's say, a digital landscape where things are, for instance, an electricity grid is managed by a computer which can get hacked. The moment you enter this digital landscape, the sort of degrees of information war, economic war, etc., escalate into a different kind of war. It's a different kind of war entirely. So what is a hybrid war? A hybrid war is not a war which is fought necessarily on a battlefield anymore. You can now take away the battlefield. Instead of having to fly the plane over the front line, there's no front line anymore. What you have an information war where you can utilize the mechanisms of media, social media, satellite media to delegitimize a government. You can suddenly say that Nicolas Maduro is not the president of Venezuela, he is a dictator. So that's information war. Then you can do diplomatic warfare. You can say, now we're going to put pressure on the Organization of American States, which basically is anyway a US puppet, and we'll say, we're going to eject the Maduro government and we'll welcome the Guaido government as the legitimate government. Wow, how did you do that? You've now delegitimized the government diplomatically. Then we're going to say, we're going to cut you off from finances. Even your money in our banks, we won't let you access. We won't let you buy and sell things. Those 5 Iranian oil tankers that came and delivered oil to Venezuela, they didn't come for free. The Venezuelans paid them. It's a normal capitalist transaction, which the United States was blocking. There's nothing out of this world. They were just selling and buying oil. It's capitalism which was being blocked. If you are a libertarian, you should be outraged by that. So that's an economic war. Then there's sabotage. You can hack into their systems and destroy electricity grids and various things. You can go in and break things. We know these things happen. So it's a range of different kinds of attacks on a country. The so-called sanctions is only one piece of it. And the more of these new techniques you use to suffocate a country, the pressure inside the country rises because the ordinary people will suffer, and the idea is they will then overthrow the government. That's the idea. You'll remember that when the United States pursued a very harsh sanctions policy on Iraq, there was a UN report that said 500,000 children had died. On a particular morning after the report came out, Madeleine Albright, then US ambassador to the United Nations, was on Good Morning America or 60 Minutes or one of these shows, and she was asked, there is this UN report that says, because of US sanctions, 500,000 Iraqi children have died. Now, Madam Albright could have said many things. One is, the report is lying. She didn't say that. She could have said, yes, people are dying, but it's because of Saddam Hussein, not because of US sanctions. She didn't say that. She could have said, I haven't looked at the report yet. We have to study it. She could have said that. She didn't. She said neither of these three things. Instead, she said, it's a price worth paying. She accepted that the United States government had a policy that killed 500,000 Iraqi children. She didn't deny it. She said it's a price worth paying. Later, she said, I regret the way I said it, but she didn't regret what she said. She said 500,000, that's worth it. So in all these hybrid wars, a range of techniques are utilized to suffocate a country in order to change the government. Now, if we have time, I'd like to just go back to say there should be a standard for this. In the United Nations Charter, which was written in 1945, there is an important part called Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. You see, they were coming after the Holocaust, one of the most grotesque events that took place in Europe. I mean, there were Holocausts in the colonies, but this was grotesque. It took place in Europe's industrial scale murder, genocide of people. So what the people who framed the charter said, what happens if a government on its sovereign territory is doing something horrendous to its own people? Well, this is not actually the case with the Holocaust, because in fact, the Nazis had gone into Poland, where they were doing a lot of activities in occupied Poland. Many of the concentration camps, the death camps, were in Poland, not in German territory. But anyway, the point is, in your sovereign territory, if you're doing something horrible to your people, what can the international community do? Under Chapter 6, there are a series of things you can do. You can publicly denounce it, diplomatic pressure. You can have economic sanctions, economic pressure, and so on. That's under Chapter 6. Under Chapter 7, you can use armed force to stop it. But you see, the UN Charter allows you to do these actions under 6 and 7 if you can demonstrate that there's a standard met of genocidal behavior by the government. See, so that's the UN Charter. The standard before you get to hybrid war is genocidal behavior. The United States government has no standard. It's people we don't like. Like, have they had to prove that the Venezuelan government of Hugo Chavez was conducting genocide against the people? There is no proof of that, and they never even tried it. They just didn't like him. Why? Because he was using oil wealth to help his people. Why did they not like Evo Morales? Not because he's conducting genocide against his people. The opposite. Evo Morales was lifting the standard of living of his people. I mean, in each of these cases, the United States uses the kind of Chapter 6, Chapter 7 techniques in the UN Charter without meeting the standard of the Charter. So they totally violate the spirit of international law in a gangster mafia-ish way, go after people they just don't like. I mean, you don't like Chavez, you want to overthrow him. Well, if you want to overthrow Chavez, why don't you overthrow the kings of Saudi Arabia? I mean, it's a fair question.
It's a very fair question. So is this the best framework for understanding in 2020 how the United States engineers this type of war, this attempt to remove somebody, that we could get to a situation where a bank in England could say, you, Venezuelan government, cannot access your own gold because some guy in the parliament has claimed he's president, and that doesn't strike everybody as insane.
Let me give you an example of this. Yes. Right when the COVID-19 pandemic was coming into the Americas, the first case was actually in Brazil in February. Around that time, to her credit, the head of the IMF announced that there's a new facility. Any country is allowed to apply for funds, any country, and you'll get it. I mean, it's not a problem. So President Maduro of Venezuela, taking the IMF at its word, applied for emergency funding so that they could buy equipment to tackle the COVID-19 problem. Within 2 days, the IMF responded saying, sorry, we can't fund you because there's a problem. Okay. So I called the IMF and I talked to the spokesperson, very nice person, and I'd spoken to him before, and I said, what's the issue here? And he said, well, I'm sending you the statement. So he sent the statement. The statement said that, well, there is a problem because the actual government of Venezuela is contested. It's not clear that it's Mr. Maduro, so he has applied. We don't accept him because there's Guaido, but because we don't have confirmation that it's Guaido and there's uncertainty, we can't give the money. Okay, so I called the IMF back and said, but on your own website, you recognize the finance minister, Mr. Zerpa, of the Maduro government as the finance minister of Venezuela. So on your website, you recognize him as the finance minister. He has signed a paper, he's signed your staff reports and so on. So what's the confusion? Within 24 hours, he disappeared from the website. Interesting. The United Kingdom has recently had a single judge in the UK High Court declare, after the Venezuelan government approached the High Court, that the Bank of England cannot turn over $1.3 billion of gold, which the Venezuelans want to sell to the United Nations Development Program to raise funds for COVID-19. The Venezuelan government doesn't want the gold to be shipped to the Swiss bank. They want to sell it to the UNDP. Let's be clear about that. That's what they have said they're going to do. Judge says, sorry, you're not the legitimate government. It's Mr. Guaido. Now, interestingly, in London, the accredited ambassador of Venezuela to the UK government is the ambassador sent by President Maduro. That means government of the United Kingdom, despite what they keep saying verbally, Boris Johnson, totally believable person, it seems, by some people, not by me, they still recognize the ambassador that's sent by the Maduro government. So what is going on here? I mean, what we have is we have a very dangerous game afoot where the United States and its allies like Great Britain are essentially running a lawless mafia campaign in the world. Whoever they don't like, they say, we don't like you, but it's contradictory. How can you say you are not the government and yet you accept the ambassador? You see, they'll continue to have problems with this. Like in Israel, for instance, the Israeli government says we are going to annex the West Bank. The hard right is very angry because the annexation of the West Bank means that you'll have to recognize the existence of Palestine. So they don't want to annex the West Bank. So you see, these are the contradictions that they keep tying themselves into. We are in favor of international law. We are not in favor of mafia annexations of Palestinians or mafia annexation of 1.3 billion Venezuelan money. We are in favor of international law. They are in favor of some sort of mafia order. I'm afraid they scare me.